this is our last session. And it will be a time in which we can pick up themes and questions that we haven't dealt with. But to set the scene, I like to say, I've got no idea how they let you on a plane to come down here, Craig. Because what I've discovered is that you've bought a very large black snake and let it loose in this hall. And I don't know what's happened to everybody, but it's certainly bitten me. And I can feel, it wouldn't be venom, but I can feel the life coming up. And it's wonderful. It's going to open my brain. And I think it's a great privilege. And with Ken, you told us there's one sun and one moon and one earth. But the point is they're actually all round, aren't they? And Aboriginal culture has this circularity in it that Craig referred to. And this is something we're so badly in need of, aren't we, with our, I think John Howard's thinking is linear, isn't it? We'll go in there, fix it up. But it actually only targets one little splinter of the process and creates chaos all around it. It's this capacity to embrace the whole cosmos, if you like, of the situation. And it's not so much what does indigenous culture need from us, but what do we need from it? I think we're in desperate need. And this is a time when I think it would be nice if we can think about a circular process here where we can have a conversation together. Of course, if we've got a question, we can ask it, or we've got a comment, but it would be really nice to let our experiences circulate around, and that way we'll all contaminate each other, won't we, in an interesting way. So I think it's important in this process we also understand the value of silence while everyone has a moment to think. But let's open it up and see what everyone's carrying now after this huge body of experience. We have microphones here.
So we'll just it's on here.
Thank you.
I want to respond to your comment about the snake.
Yeah.
So really, that's, you go back and you pick up, I'm talking to myself, you pick up a phrase or a comment that was made by a senior man, a senior woman, and it gets knitted into the body system. So when Japaljarri Spencer painted that black snake, the Jungarai Wanu, Ngangkari Jungarai Wanu, he said very specifically, and I listen to what he says, and I kind of have to do that carefully. He said, this Jungarai Wanu black snake is for the doctors. Get that? Like, it wasn't a coincidence. Here's the man who's well known to you, and his Jungarai Wanu, and he's making his last painting, 2014, knowing he's on the way to death through various forms of diabetes and so forth. Makes his last painting, except for a couple of others that he got money for, and says, this painting is for the doctors. Here are the doctors. It travels. This is a Jukurrpa that travels, and it's traveled across the border into the white doctor domain. That's why they let it on the plane. Okay, I've done my bit.
Thank you.
Paul Mayfield. Melinda, you mentioned early that you see the strength of the Indigenous community is people with place, the connection between people and place. Yet in reading your book about See How We Roll, what I gathered from that is almost about displacement through violence in the homeland or the bureaucracy that people are enforced to. It almost means there's a revolution from Central Australia down to Adelaide for medical treatment and back up. I'm interested yourself or other speakers to know, do you have hope or see any evidence of people being able to almost resettle, reconnect with country with a sense of permanence and pride? That's a really, really tough question you've asked me, Paul. A tough question. A tough question because I can only address it with specificity. So as soon as you ask me that question, I have very particular people in mind. So in the tradition that we've continued with today, I feel like I need to say just a little bit more about the story of the people who are now in Adelaide. These are people who went to Adelaide as a result of a protracted family feud that could not be resolved because of those new government laws that I spoke about that intervened and stopped Warlpiri people from sorting out their own trouble via the mechanisms that we've heard about that sort things out like that and say, right, done, finished now, we move on. If people no longer have the capacity to sort out their own troubles via their own means, these problems, they go on and they go on and they go on. And so what happened in this case is that rather than people in a fighting context retreating to their homelands, they retreated to Adelaide. And I was so shocked when that first happened, because that was a very, very profound decision to say that we no longer feel safe on our sacred land. We feel safer going to Adelaide and being put up in the police academy, which is where people stayed in the first instance. Now, most of those people have now gone back to Yuendamu. We've been hearing today about, many things, many devastating things that have happened subsequently. That means that that community is still dealing with many, many layers of difficulty. But so you have that going on in the town, in the Warlpiri town, and you have the people who've moved to Adelaide, and there are a small number of people, but there have been many generations of people who've gone to Adelaide before them for a range of reasons. And they are staying there because that feels like the safe place to be at the moment. There's still too much trouble at home. So things are still in limbo. You've read my book and you know that there's no happy ending, but there's also no ending. Very deliberately, I leave that open with a very hopeful image of country again, because even for those people in Adelaide, they're holding their country in their bodies and in their hearts and in their memories and in their discussions with people all the time. And they go back to that country when they can. And that is a source of unparalleled, incomparable security and the affirmation of the self. So that is still there. I'm just going to leave you with that hope hanging in response to your terribly hard question.
Finish that off. So this is where traditional sort of punishment, right? It's not also kind of, just a spearing. It's about actually chastising as well and saying banishment as well. But what that sort of does is cleansing, because it's about correcting what sort of went wrong. But everyone's involved in it. So the father-in-laws, the mother-in-laws are involved in it, the uncles, the aunties, everyone that's actually part of the victim's family and the perpetrator's family. They all come together. They reconcile and if they had to sort of kind of lacerate or sort of kind of just give some beatings to that sort of member, but it's all with love as well. And then explanation, and then placed in a place where they could heal. So a place for smoke, sit in smoke to heal, and then you're welcome back to community. And everything's a clean slate. Where in this case, we sort of kind of put them into prison and they could sort of kind of do 6 years to sort of 10 years in prison, but that problem still hasn't been resolved. So it then starts again. And then it sort of kind of allows for individuals to then take on the role of the punisher, the executioner, and all that kind of stuff. You know, take the law into their own hands. So they've taken cultural matters into their own hands. And that's when it becomes really ugly. And then that's where it becomes there's no end to the game because it hasn't sort of followed the right process for healing. And then reintegration.
This is speaking as a white person. So I know that there's been a lot of stirring up about this thing of punishment and payback. And I know it's badly reported and I know all kinds of legal issues about it, but I just want to tell you, I witnessed one of these situations that you're talking about, several actually, but this will give you an idea of exactly what Kenny is saying. A boy in that particular community had inadvertently, but nevertheless, had been responsible for the death of another young person. He was underage. And there was a big meeting. What do we do? And at that stage, the police had agreed that so long as there wasn't a lot of fuss, the punishment process could go ahead, provided the police could be nearby to make sure that there was no further trouble. Not tactical response, 3 Aboriginal policemen, a couple of sergeants, and they all stood right back. So then there was this gathering. I don't know, 50 men or something, right up to the mouth. And I was allowed, invited, because I was living in that community at the time, and told just stay there and you can watch and don't do anything. Watch. So then the grandfather of the boy presented himself and said, "You can't do this to the boy. I will take a spear." And then there was a big argument. Everybody's saying, "No, Gus, you can't do that." I gave a clue. "No, you can't, you're old Juppie, you can't do that." And then there was a big argument. And he's saying, "Fuck all you, I'm going to take this." And it got quite heated, as it would. And then finally, another man came up who was directly related to the boy. And he said, "Gus, you let me do it." And there was a big discussion, everybody making. And then everybody agreed that this man who had a relationship to the boy was watching, he then stepped out. And then, I forget exactly, 2 men, I think, brought a very sharp implement and injury into the leg. And then he turned and he started walking back to where I was, sitting beside his vehicle. And he said, "Jungarai, take me to the clinic He was limping, but standing. Blood, everything. And I said, am I going to drive? He said, no, I'm going to fucking drive. Just get in the side. So I got in the side and he drove to the clinic. They fixed him up. Everything was settled. The police melted away, shook hands, said goodbye. Gus was happy and there was no further. That's the true story. I don't know where this is.
It strikes me that that's activating an ancient pattern of justice, isn't it?
Well, it's a settlement.
That's deeply ingrained and has enormous power because of it's so deeply ingrained.
And if I could just extend that too, it's like, you know, it's the spilling of the blood, it's the purification. It's as simple as that. It's a religious sort of kind of thing as well. So when we sort of go to church, what do we have? The blood and the body of Christ. And it's a cleansing process. It's the same thing. You're cleansing your sin just by spilling your own blood, right? And in this case, so you're taking the blood, you're taking the punishment on behalf of your loved one, right? So it's like the perpetrator is loved by their own family, and their own family takes up the actual pain as well. So you can have you could have more than sort of just one lineup as well. I've got a relationship with this person, I take the punishment as well. And in the same time, sort of indicating, hey, I love you so much that I'm doing this for you, but don't do it again.
It's not very Western, is it?
No, but I think psychoanalysts would understand it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, but the Western culture started like that. It was pretty barbaric too.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, like the
Absolutely.
pressing and the hanging and the burning,
Yep.
Old Testament style.
I just want to you commented on it being barbaric, but if you contrast that with what was happening in Dondale, I think I'd say that Dondale was much more barbaric.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to provide a corrective to that.
Hello, John Robertson's my name. I think I'm addressing this largely to Ken. It's a question about identity and role in young Aboriginal people. I'm working in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, and part of my job is to help run a team that provides mental health services to the Aboriginal community in the eastern suburbs. And what we've done over the years is we've taken on a group of young Aboriginal trainees who learn in our system, but also we're learning from them. And what they do is they help us to provide culturally safe services, and they do a wonderful job. But it puts them in a very difficult situation, because what we find is that the organisation then expects them, well, first of all, I should explain that they've come from 4 different states in Australia. None of our trainees are actually from local lands here. And the service then expects them to be, I suppose, the nominal Aboriginal people, you see, and to have all the answers. And so they get put onto committees for various things to give the indigenous voice, often finding themselves sort of beyond their scope. And at the same time, they're carrying the difficult burden of having been disconnected from their own culture and struggling to find their own roots and connecting to who their mob is and where their land is. And so there's sort of, when they're pressed, if anything, there's a sort of you can pick up a sense of emptiness and shame as well in them, particularly with this expectation. And I just wonder if you'd have any comments about that difficult scenario.
Yeah. I suppose the beauty of sort of kind of our fellow Aussies is that they've recorded a lot of stuff. You know, like there's been anthropologists that actually recorded a lot of very sacred stuff and all that. They're sort of sitting in the museums. So it's a matter of sort of those young people sort of kind of having maybe, just an inkling of where they come from, and they could find it. But they've got to be guided in that sort of process as well, because not all information is sort of safe information. So, and I think that's the dilemma that we all face too in regards to what's our modern identity? What's the modern Aboriginal person look like? Are we going to be sort of standing with the lap and the spear? You know, it's just that our identity, or have we moved on as modern people with a laptop and a mobile phone? You know, so we've got to be happy with our sort of kind of movement and our process as well, because that sort of shows our movement as people, that we've been evolving for the last sort of 200 odd years, which is, you know, that sort of liberates us too. So being part of, you know, like, you know, the 84, we had the last lot of desert people walk in, but their life would have been just catapulted into sort of, you know, getting in a car to drive and sort of kind of so many kilometers within a day. How cool was that, instead of walking, to be able to use a gun, to be able to shoot something, you know, all that sort of kind of just, wow, magic stuff, yeah. But yeah, so we I suppose work in this really amazing space between the two worlds. But what we've got to realize that we can actually expand on that space in the middle and make it ours. So, and that's when we start defining ourselves as people of this country, sharing a common heritage and responsibility. So yeah, maybe we should chat a bit later or something. Yeah, thank you.
We have a question over here.
Hi, thanks everybody. My name's Mara. I'm related to Craig. And I guess my question or reflection is perhaps partly to Melinda, partly to Ken, but it's picking up on, I think, Ken's really eloquent explanation of the common law system and the reminder that it's not a fixed system either, and that we need to be turning that adaptive attention to that system as much as constantly asking Indigenous people, what are they going to do to adapt to ours? And I would just be interested in your reflections on the inquest, actually, the Walker inquest, because my understanding from a distance is that that was a process that was a bit more attentive to some of the more sort of complex interactions that were happening. And yeah, just invite some reflections on whether you thought that had offered an adaptive Western, I mean, the colonial jurisdiction is the oldest jurisdiction, common law jurisdiction, whether it had shown some potential for collaborative.
I'll answer that first, but I want to give it from a Aboriginal perspective in regards to what they saw. From a murder perspective, what they saw is the same law is going to be applied to this particular person. It didn't apply. This person did not spend 1 minute in the cell, and people are scratching their head. What happened? How come he's treated differently? Is this law for everyone, or is this law for just the privileged? So they were asking that question in regards to how come he didn't get into remand in custody, because this is what happens to any Aboriginal person that commits an offence. You have no choice but to sit in remand until your court is heard. And you could sit in remand for 2 years. And then you only had a sort of kind of minor offence, but you've served 2 years prior to that, waiting for court. So they're scratching their head and saying, well, how come the same system did not apply? He did not spend 1 minute in the cell. He was sort of kind of outside, and when all people was on, so you could be only paroled in your community and you're restricted in the Northern Territory. He was back home. So people is kind of like, you know, scratching their head there and say, well, how fair is this system?
For sure. He was back home and he was on full pay. You know, so from, you know, in terms of that sense of the law operating in two profoundly different modes, depending who is the accused of murder, phenomenal. there are so many ways one could respond to your question, of course. Just kind of picking up on where we were at before. One thing that has been very, very striking in the inquest room, a couple of things. Firstly, the coroner and the coronial team have gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure that process would be as good a possible process for Warlpiri as it could possibly be. You're probably aware that there's a long line of critique of inquests as being just spaces where trauma is reignited. Come on and tell us again what happened. Let's watch that video again and again and again and again. There was a decision made very early on that the footage of that shooting would not be shown in the inquest, for example. There were hearings on the ground out at Yuendamu, out of camera, with the media kept out. There was a lot of back and forth with Warlpiri elders to determine what they wanted at the outset that was sort of at the heart of the establishment of these very, very broad parameters for the inquest and an extraordinary length of time. So all of that was interesting. But one thing that I've just found so striking in sitting there listening to the discussion was you have these, and I'm going to call them white anti-racist lawyers. Okay, so people like us, but there are certain things that I could unpack around that kind of category of a white anti-racist that has its own cultural assumptions that goes with it, okay? And one is that payback, as we've just heard it very, very eloquently described, does grievous bodily harm. So these white anti-racist lawyers cannot go past that. Every time these discussions in court would come to, well, how can we accommodate? How can we accommodate the honour of the Aboriginal customary legal system and to lift it up again, as it were, to bring it back to a place where it had tremendous respect? And, you know, through the period that, you know, Craig's been describing, through the 90s, there were so many cases of payback. And I go like that because the term has become so stigmatized. You need to add more in to give it its moral weight that Kenny has done so beautifully for us. But the law didn't necessarily allow, the white law, European law, did not explicitly say this can happen. But the attitudes in the wider community and policing and government at that time said, we live in a period in which something called self-determination is a primary concern. And this idea of two ways, of doing two things two ways in the Northern Territory is preeminent. So we quietly allow these things to happen. The police sitting off to the side, but quietly allowing things to happen. And so many court cases would recognise that, okay, we know this person is going to go back home and they're going to be treated in this way by elders. And so the sentence is this, not this. You know, those sorts of decisions were being made and made again. What was so striking, you know, 20, 30 years on, is the way in which this grievous bodily harm gets spoken as something that cannot go past. Whereas we've just had this magnificent explanation of, well, actually, it's something altogether different. And Pam's point about Dondale and the terror and the traumas of imprisonment as, you know, and solitary confinement, how one can go to anything more profoundly devastating at the level of the, you know, the impact on the person of that kind of punishment. It's there writ large in the history of European civilization that says we have moved beyond being savages. We no longer hang, draw and quarter people. We put them in prison, and that's the mark of civilization. Whereas the mark of something in the leg is seen as a return to savagery. I'm with my colleagues in thinking this is an honourable system. And I think we, wider Australia, have got one hell of a job to do to make that case back to the lawyers and the politicians to insist that there is something profoundly human in a system, in a coherent, integrated system of law that is asserting the social body, that's saying we stand all together as the people who take responsibility for this thing that has been done. I mean, that's phenomenal and carries so much more weight than extracting an individual, saying you bear the responsibility for what you've done. We cut the context out around that person, send them off to jail, and then we don't have to think about the problems at large in our society that have caused that set of circumstances. Sorry, you can see I can go on and on in response to your question. Thank you.
Oh, I was just going to say also, I think in discussions that I've had too, that I think without having customary law recognised, which happened with the intervention, that it really has disempowered traditional authority. I mean, it goes on in secret anyway, a lot of the time, but it's really disempowered at at a legal public level. And also what I've observed in the courts is that invariably Aboriginal people don't understand the court process, heavily reliant on the lawyers. The lawyers are also restricted by certain, laws and so on and so forth, so that it really is a system. And also there are not very few Aboriginal people on the electoral roll, so they don't get on the juries and so on. So it's a very inequitous system. And I just wanted to point that out. And if you want to go and sit in the courts in Alice Springs, I think, and immerse yourself there, it's actually a very painful as well as sort of revelatory process to experience. Sort of shame, I think.
Yeah. Hi, Yasabaka from Brisbane. I was just thinking about us talking about colonialism and that the colonial state of mind still exists. It's not just in the past, it's living and alive in us, whether it's in our psyche or in the society. And I'm not saying it's the only state of mind, but it does exist and it's quite powerful. And I think it's powerful because it serves three functions for us at least. One, it allows us to disavow and not own the horrors and what we have done to the nation and the people, so we can keep it at arm's length or away from us. Two, I think this colonial state of mind also allows us to project the badness. So we don't own our badness. It's the First Nations or the other who's bad, and we can say that it's all because of them. But the third important reason is this colonial state of mind still allows us to be parasitic and exploit the land. The resources, the oil, the gas, the minerals, the land with different aspects. If we give up the colonial state of mind, we need to come into terms that this land does not belong to us and how we have to respect it and look after it. And I think all these factors, among others, maintain this colonial state of mind and keep it alive.
That's extremely eloquent, and I can only say yes, I fully agree.
Tell them the story of bombs.
No, that's
We have another question.
So this state of mind that we are calling colonial, if we were to address this as an unconscious psychoanalytic problem, how would part of our training, for example, or our supervision, for example, assist the practitioners, the doctors, the social workers, the mental health workers, the administrators involved in hospital help? How would we go through some sort of understanding process to slightly decolonise the mind's attitudes? This is a question that preoccupies me a lot more recently as we're moving into the voice. I think I just want to put the question there for us to how might we as a profession follow that ethic and do no harm.
If I can just venture a little comment, as a group psychotherapist, it means we have to analyse the cultural and national and collective features of the psyche, don't we? With ourselves as part of it. Yeah. Anyway.
I'm David Motion. I just wanted to comment, and following on what you said, that in my experience, the only way I started to really look at my colonial outlook, which I never thought I had, was when I started working with Aboriginal people. And I think it's hard for me to understand how people can really start confronting how they think until they get to know people. I mean, it's the same with any person other than oneself, obviously, but particularly so given our history, and certainly for someone my age, given the education I had about Aboriginal people, that somehow, and this is where I think the voice is important, so important, is for people to actually become aware of who people are, and to start to look more at how they think about them.
Thank you. Christine.
Yes, I'm Christine Vickers, and I'm a psychotherapist and also a historian, and I'm a descendant of missionary that I've written about. What I would like to add to what's just been said is that one of the things we need to confront in our culture, and we hear it still weaving our way through in the discourse today, is the phenomenon of so-called scientific racism, and how that pattern keeps repeating and repeating and repeating in terms of who decides who is capable of administering or managing their own lives. And with the Howard intervention, which when I was actually handling in my doctorate at the time, and my supervisor was saying, this is a great thing. I was thinking, what? Because it was so resonant of what had happened in 1937 and what happened in 1914 in New South Wales, in which white administrators were actually depriving Indigenous people of their rights in the name of preserving the superiority of the white race. And I think this is something that's very hard to confront when you're actually one of them, having to listen to how your forebears or one's forebears, and whether it's all of us in this room have those forebears, that they're actually part of our formation now. And how do we actually then continue to address this? I think we've got a long journey ahead.
Thanks, Christine. We've got about just a little over 5 minutes or so. I wonder what other thoughts are in the room.
Are there any comments from our online participants? Please raise your hand and we can introduce you into the conversation. Oh, hang on, I can see someone raising their hand. Anne Norton, let me unmute you and add spotlight. Oh, nope. Play spotlight. Nope. And we can't hear you yet. We need to unmute you. Hold on. Unmute. Let me do it. Unmute.
Oh,
there
yeah.
you go.
Good. I did send a question, but it did not seem to make it. what really I was stirred by what Mara said. Are there ways one could leap over Commonwealth stuff to the United Nations around traditional punishment? That was the first question. Looking at the human rights, indigenous human rights. And the other question was, how can the voice, do you think the voice will be able to start interpreting indigenous behaviour in a way which is not seen as criminal or psychiatric? Do you think there'll be pathways for that? And the other thing is on our own colonisation. I mean, I think we have to say that both Freud and Jung colonised. They took people's ideas from different countries and made a theory out of it. So we are very much still caught in it, I think. I'm finished.
Any comments to Anne's provocative?
Three questions. They weren't all provocative, Rob.
Very good suggestions, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, particularly Mara, I was interested in I know she's a institutional sort of lawyer, whether there were any precedents around that jumping over.
Yes, sorry, Anne, I hadn't picked that one up. Look, I'm going to start by saying I'm not an international lawyer. I'm an evidence lawyer, which means it's one of the reasons why I'm kind of locked at the trial and inquest stage. I think that I get, and I'm going to, this is just my personal sort of sense, is that I think while the international forum carries with it a richer kind of sense of what the possibilities are, I don't feel that it's the way through myself, it's the way through this issue, the issue of how do you actually genuinely engage at the local level with both creating responsive common law legal institutions and also, properly recognising the for example, the Warlpiri kind of structures. That would be my sense. I think it can be a really useful lever to prompt that consideration, but I don't think it's a way where you can, because in a sense it's another sort of imposition from at a point that I think what we really need to be doing here is localized. But that's my view. It's not not an expert view in any way on that front.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any final comments?
I'd like to ask other questions.
You got a question?
No, I don't have a question.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'd like to do something rather unexpectedly bold. We have a gentleman up the back, psychiatrist, who works in Alice Springs Hospital, who's come to this, and he's not a white colonialist. He's from some other foreign country. I wonder if you'd like to make a final comment. You've heard this. I wonder if there's something you having gathered all this and from your experience would like to make a kind of winding up comment, Doctor.
Thanks for putting me on the spot. I'm Zora. I've been working in Alice Springs for almost 5 years now, and it's been a really great day and really quite inspiring to hear everyone and their experience. And I guess this is how you start decolonizing, is by listening to other people and hearing them. And it's been really quite galvanizing to be here. So thank you.
Thank you. So I hope you feel like me, with a lot of half-formed thoughts that are wanting to be thought about all this. I'm going to ask Tim to come up and say a few closing words. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. I was asked to bookend the day, prologue and epilogue. So it's a slightly different task to what you've been doing, Rob, which is drawing reactions from all the different sessions. As I understand it, an epilogue is usually a term referred for a piece that's written at the end of a novel that essentially ties up all the loose ends and links the themes together so that everyone's clear on how the story ends. Sorry, I'm not able to do that for you. What I can do, though, is maybe just very briefly, just to attempt to pick up on some of the threads today and attempt to link them into some sort of summary about what we set out to do today and where it's kind of ended up, where it's left us. That is to say something about how ultimately we might have contributed something to the understanding of the significance and the importance of this upcoming referendum. We might have hopefully demonstrated in particular how psychoanalytic listening has and can assist the emergence of an effective Indigenous voice. So following my prologue, which I hope provided an overview of what needs to be given voice to and how psychoanalytic listening could possibly facilitate this, especially linking it to the statement from the heart, I think we were taken on quite an emotional journey into the details of this and the pain of it. In his presentation, Craig gave us a particularly vivid account of how he's found that psychoanalytic understanding can empower the Indigenous voice, understandings that began from his early childhood engagement. And I think listening to discussion at morning tea and lunchtime, it was really, I think, by your use of artwork particularly, that I heard people say really helped to take us into a much deeper appreciation of the issue of attunement to symbolic communication, particularly when we have no language necessarily in common, and how this links to a way of thinking about what you referred to as this play and interplay of ontologies that are not our own. One of the things I guess we didn't emerge in our discussion was really how cultural narcissism always resists difference. Yeah, so it's we haven't talked really about how cultural narcissism suffer an immediate resistance to difference and different ontologies. The other thing then was Pamela also gave us this particularly moving account, I think, of the devastating effect of what she referred to as soul murder, and considered how psychoanalytic interventions can potentially heal souls, with her focus on young people. I'm sort of reminded too about, it was one of the slogans in the old juvenile justice system, which was, that adolescence is the period of a second chance of healing and identity formation and so on. In doing so, I think Pamela alluded to the complementarity and relevance of psychoanalytic understanding with Indigenous culture and its nuances, especially in relation to the important concept of country, which sort of linked through the day. And I think we've all increasingly sort of understood the importance of that. In the panel chaired by Eve Steele, Kenny, you gave us this really lively and culturally educational presentation, again, not this time through art, but your PowerPoint slides, which I found very impacting, and particularly those wonderful complementary pyramids, which said so much in those diagrams that was so helpful to me in understanding. And also, I found myself a bit on the edge of my seat with Chris Croker's presentation, which was so personal, so evocative, and so authentic. But again, really very impressive. And then Melinda, your very elegant presentation, which spoke to the way you've immersed yourself in the immediacy of experience about the things you talked about. And I don't think your message could have come across without that. But all those presentations, I think, took us more deeply into an understanding of the importance of some of these big concepts, the intercultural responsibility, use of culture and law, and how that was applied to the Walker inquest hearings. Again, sort of rather dark, but in another sense, possibly hopeful as well. I'd just like to say that finally then, Rob Gordon, in his usual containing way, gathered up our reactions from all of you. And I thought that was a particularly lively discussion and a really helpful crystallization of a lot of things in people's minds about the presentation and how they have helped to articulate some of the important aspects of the voice that many of us feel need to be assured by an affirmative vote in the upcoming referendum. Moreover, I'm also proud to be part of today's Freud Conference because I think it's also part of a series of ongoing attempts to support the Indigenous voice by psychoanalysts and psychotherapists, notably Cassie, who've held a number of conferences on reconciliation and so on, the Freud Conference itself. I speak to my own society, the initiatives taken by the Australian Psychoanalytical Society, people here like Risa Becker who were involved in that series, which was very helpful. It was like a dialogue between psychoanalysis and also the PPAA. Together, I think in doing all these things, we are contributing in an important way, especially through our attempts to articulate the ongoing impacts of intergenerational trauma through our particular skill set of psychoanalytic listening. And I think Freud would be very pleased to see us all use the conference that remembers him in this way. So I thought a fitting way to end my remarks would be to invite you to view just a very short video, which I think is moving and optimistic and might hopefully have its own sequel at some stage, that being a report on the success of the upcoming referendum. I'm really returning to your comments, Ken, where you said, because I think this video points to this, let's look at what we have done and what we can do, and let's be optimistic. So let's watch this video.
The 1960s were a time for change, from pop culture to milestones in science.
It's one small step for man.
And human rights movements.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Here in Australia, people's attitudes were also starting to change. For a long time, Indigenous people didn't have the same rights as other Australians. They faced a lot of discrimination and weren't counted as citizens of their own country. But many Indigenous and non-Indigenous Aussies realised that things could and should be different, and they started demanding equality. In 1962, all Indigenous people were given the right to enrol to vote in federal elections like everyone else. In 1965, Indigenous workers stood up against unfair working conditions and fought for land rights. And in the same year, uni students protested against racism and poor living conditions around country New South Wales.
Mrs. Bandler, how concerned are you as a New South Wales representative?
Around this time, activists had also set their sights on a really big goal that would involve the whole nation. They wanted to change sections of the country's constitution which discriminated.
And I feel that the time has come when Australia can no longer tolerate legal racial discrimination against its Indigenous people.
The Constitution is the most important legal document in the whole country. It sets out just how Australia works, so how the government's put together, how the courts work, how the states work, and what the government can and can't do. So changing it isn't easy. To change the Constitution, there has to be a referendum. That's where everyone over 18 votes yes or no to the changes. To get the government to even hold that referendum, campaigners set out to get signatures on a petition. They set up tables in the streets of all capital cities and country towns, and even waited outside footy matches and churches. Eventually, they collected 100,000 signatures, and after 10 years of campaigning, they finally got their vote. On May 27, 1967, Australians went to the polls. In the end, 90% voted yes to changing the Constitution. It was the biggest yes vote in our nation's history. The changes meant 2 lines were removed from the document, giving Indigenous people the right to be included in Australia's population figures and giving the federal government the power to make laws for Indigenous Australians. That last one later paved the way for things like the Land Rights Act, which has given many Indigenous Aussies traditional ownership of their land again. "50 years on, there are still problems that need to be solved. And for many years, people have been pushing to change Australia's constitution again because it doesn't recognise Indigenous Australians as the nation's first people. And it still lets governments make laws which discriminate based on race. But the 1967 referendum is still seen as a milestone in our country's history that brought Australians together and changed the nation for the better."
So let's keep our hopes up and let's be optimistic. In the couple of minutes remaining, it's just my pleasure now to hand you back to the chair of the Freud Conference Organising Committee, Christine Hill, who will just say some closing words. In asking Chris to come up, I just want to acknowledge this is actually the 25th Freud Conference, so it's a big anniversary. And Chris has been a total stalwart as the organising chair of these Freud conferences for 25 years. So I'd ask Chris to take a bow as she comes up.
Yeah, look, thanks very much, everyone, for being here today. It's been a terrific conference, and I'd like to thank especially all the presenters who spoke today, and the chairs who did a great job, and also the audience who has been such a very good audience too. I'm not very good at writing that, at making speeches. That's why I dream up the idea of a Freud conference and hand it over to everyone else. And then I can come and enjoy myself for the day. But yeah, I think today has been one of a very special day because of the emotion, I think, that has been around all day. And and this has been a really, really special conference, which I was really delighted. I dreamed it up one morning. I thought it'd be great to do something one day with the First Nation people. And I actually rang Craig, and he was so excited about it and jumped off, and he said, "Right, I'll be right there. We start from now." And I think that's how it really began and how it's continued. And for myself, it was a very emotional day. I think the experience of the First Nation peoples is one that we will never experience ourselves. But I hope that one day and very soon the government will wake up and we will have a voice for the people who have not had it for so many years, or have never had it before. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone, and thank you again for the presenters and the chairs. and the audience who've been such a responsive one. Thank you. Sorry, just one more word. I have to think ahead, and we've already got plans for Freud Conference for next year, and it's going to be Solomon Actor, who's a fantastic speaker, and he was here in 2010. Unfortunately, he's been quite ill, but he said he would love to do the conference, except he won't be able to leave his country, so it will need to be online. But we thought that rather than having it just everyone at home online, we would bring everyone here or everyone into the auditorium or to the brain centre here, and we would have them in a big screen, and everyone would still be able to see their friends and mix around and also enjoy Solomon Actor, who is a really, really good speaker. Yeah.
Hang on, stand right there.
It's my brother.
Look, without sort of kind of people like Chris, you know, we wouldn't be able to have a conversation like this. We need to have this kind of conversation. And it's great to see you guys here today. Thanks for coming along and listening and making it worthwhile, because it's about us going forward, and we are the one that actually go to the polling booth and sort of say yes or no. So it's really up to us. And thank you very much. Thanks, fam, for getting me involved, and Craig for cracking the whip as well. Thank you. And it's been great. Lovely day. Thank you very much.
A final thing, Jeremy's done the recording for this, and we'll send you a link to it. As soon as we put it up. Hey, Jeremy.